Good afternoon, everyone. This is Leanne Bryan from the National Center on Subsidy, Innovation, and Accountability, welcoming you to our Year 3 state webinar, Error Rate Training, walking you through successful completion of your case reviews and the ACF-404 report. I think we're going to go ahead and jump right in today. I don't think we need to wait for anyone else specifically to join. So again, my name's Leanne Bryan, and also presenting this afternoon for the Subsidy Center is Katie Watts. And as I look at this slide, I just can't help but smile here. This is actually my first time seeing this slide. The pictures shown here are, of course, of us, but also of our amazing children. April is Month of the Young Child, so we thought we'd change things up a little bit and share some pictures of the most important children in our lives, our kids. My two boys are Caden and Gavin, and Katie's daughter's name is Julia. Just a little different introduction there for us, and thank you, Shelley, for that idea. Here's our agenda for our time together this afternoon. But before we get started, I did just want to share briefly that it might be a good idea to print the slides. Actually, Katie, I should have confirmed with you. Did the slides go out to all of our attendees? I don't see a handout handout in our dashboard. Katie, are you muted?
Yes, I was muted. I'm sorry. I did send out the handouts to everyone a couple hours ago. If you did not get them, you can feel free to send me an email, kwatts@wrma.com, and I will forward them to you in the next couple of minutes.
Thank you, Katie. Yes, I'm guessing that email did encourage you all to print the slides, but just in case, do encourage you to print the slides as well as the mid-table and have that in front of you. It might be useful this afternoon. So again, the agenda is reflected here on the slide. We're going to review the use of the mid-table, including talking through some examples of completing the mid-table. We're going to get everyone oriented or maybe reoriented with the online data collection system, the OLDC. That's the system where the ACF report is entered. We're also going to talk through each individual item of the ACF-404 or the improper payments report. And throughout, we'll open it up for questions and then get into discussion of next steps for our Year 3 state. So here is our timeline for you all and your completion of the record review process. I'm going to jump in here. So, we all know that you've all already submitted your SDAPs and record review worksheets, and you're currently completing your case reviews. So the last day for the ACF-404 submission is June 30th of this summer, so 2 months away. And then for anyone that may need to submit a corrective action plan, that's due 60 days after the ACF-404 submission. So if we look at the timeline, just a different way, same thing, same information, just shown a different way here. I'm going to focus on the second column. Again, the last day to submit the improper payments report is June 30th, 2019. That's a Sunday, so we do encourage everyone, actually maybe even we beg, to please submit your reports early if at all possible. It gives us a chance to review. You're most likely going to get comments back from OCC, so the sooner we get them and can start reviewing, the better for everyone. And the last day to submit the corrective action plan, or the ACF-405, is 60 days after the ACF-404 submission. And the corrective action plans are required if your error rate falls at or above 10%. Any questions before we move into the mid-table? I don't see any in the question box, and I don't believe I mentioned this, but as always, feel free to raise your hand if you have questions using the GoTo dashboard, or you can type your questions into the questions panel in GoTo dashboard. I don't see anything, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Katie to talk through the Midtable.
Thanks, Leanne. So we did want to spend a little bit of time talking about the Midtable. I know we have addressed this in previous webinars as well, but we specifically wanted to address the totals row in the Midtable. So one of the handouts that I emailed everyone kind of laid out how to complete the totals row, but I did want to talk through some of these examples actually on the call as well. So this should probably be a review for most of you. If you are conducting the error rate reviews or are otherwise involved in the process, you probably are familiar with this information. But again, the Midtable is a new part of the record review worksheet. If you are a Year 3 state who is using the new record review worksheet template, the Midtable is a part of that template. Those states who are using the old record review worksheet template are not technically required to complete the Midtables, but they still must collect that data on missing or insufficient documentation errors that might result in an improper payment. And the purpose of the Midtable, of course, is to record data on all of the mid errors that may result in an improper payment, regardless of whether this additional inquiry process was used. This is, again, just a reminder on what parts of the Midtable are completed by the reviewers. And I'll show you this kind of as a visual in the next slide. But reviewers complete columns 2 through 4 for each mid-error that might result in an improper payment, so a potential improper payment. Column 5 only if the additional inquiry was conducted, column 5 only if the additional inquiry was not conducted. Sorry, I said that wrong. And you would complete columns 6 through 9 only if the additional inquiry was conducted. So this is, again, a visual representation of what I mentioned on the last slide, which columns need to be filled out. And this is, again, also on that handout. So the totals row, I'm just going back to this slide for a moment. You can see on the Midtable, the very bottom row is where the totals are recorded for certain columns. The totals are completed for columns 3, 4, 7, and 8. And the goal here for this row, the totals row, is to gather information that feeds into element 500 if you're using the new template. And regardless of which record review worksheet template you're using, this information is also used to complete items in the ACF-404 final report. So that's why it's very important to make sure that this data is being collected accurately. And completing this totals row has been, the source of some confusion, and we completely understand that. So I'm hoping to clarify this, both on this call as well as in the handout. So if your Midtable only has one error, so there's only one error recorded in the rows, then what's entered in the total row would equal what was entered in that element row. So then it's pretty straightforward, I think. And I'm going to show you an example here. To save space, I've cut out all of the rows that we're not going to be talking about. Those are the rows that kind of have the slashes through them. So I have the header, then I show element 330 row, which is where the error was, and then I show the total. So you can see there was one row, one element with an error, and the totals here on the bottom just equal what I've entered for that row in 330. So the dollar amount of the improper payment, the total would just equal 510, and so on. The total for column 1 just equals the total for column 4 just equals what I've entered for that column in row 330, and so on. So this should be pretty straightforward when there's only one error. But if there's multiple errors, there are some specific and more specific instructions here. We need to look at columns 4 and 7 as true totals. So what you would be doing is just summing up what was entered for each of the rows that had an error in columns 4 and 7. However, columns 3 and 8 need to reflect the case findings for the whole. So this means you may not necessarily be doing a true total. What we're interested in is kind of how the total represents the case as a whole. And the important thing to think about here for columns 3 and 8 are to consider whether the same dollars were in error and or mitigated. And let me show you a couple of examples. So here I have an example of a mid-table in which there were errors in 330 and 400. I'm going to start with column 4. Column 4 asks if there was an additional inquiry that can be made. And you can see here for both of the errors, the one in 330 and in 400, the reviewer answered yes, there is an additional inquiry that can be made. Moving to column 7, again, the reviewer answered yes, the improper payment was mitigated using the additional inquiry. So as I mentioned in the last slide, for columns 4 and 7, the totals row needs to reflect kind of a true total of what was in that column. So here, for column 7, we've totaled 1 and 1 for 2. And in column 7, we've done the same thing. The totals row is 2. So here's where it gets a little trickier. Looking at column 3, the dollar amount of the potential improper payment. For both element 330 and 400, it would have been, the potential improper payment reflects the total of the entire case, so $510 we're going to say. Since these are the same dollars that have the potential improper payment, we're going to just enter 510 for the totals. Since both elements had the potential improper payment and they were the same dollars, we want to make sure that this total amount reflects the case as a whole. So the case as a whole had $510 in potential improper payments. Moving over to column 8, it's the same idea. Enter the dollar amount that was mitigated. In this case, the additional inquiry would have been successful in both elements. So the amount that would have been mitigated is $510 for both rows. However, since these are the same dollars, again, the column needs to reflect the case as a whole. So we just enter $510 were mitigated for this case. It's possible that you might run into a situation where the case has multiple potential improper payment errors due to mid, but they might have been both partial overpayments, potential overpayments, or maybe one was a full overpayment and one was partial. And that's where it can get really tricky. And I don't want to, really get into that right now because we haven't really seen it happen a lot yet. But if you do run into that situation, we really do encourage you to reach out to your regional office for technical assistance on how to complete that in that scenario. Let's look at another example. In this example, again, we had errors in 330 and 400. So in column 4, the reviewer has said that yes, there is an additional inquiry that can be made for both. So we've entered 1 for both rows. But moving over to column 7, you can see that in row 330, the improper payment was not able to be mitigated. So they have entered 0 here. For 400, the improper payment was mitigated, the error was mitigated, so the reviewer has entered 1. As in the last example, columns 4 and 7 should reflect the true totals of those columns. So the reviewer has entered 2 for column 4 and 1 for column 7. In column 3, the dollar amount of the potential improper payment was $510 for both, so both would have been total potential overpayments. Since they were the same dollars, we're entering $510 for the total. It's reflecting the case as a whole. Moving over to column 8, you can see that since the error in 330 was not able to be mitigated, we have $0 here. The error in 400 was mitigated. However, the total here that we've entered is 0. And that's because even though the error in 510 was mitigated, that error in 330 still remained. And since it was not able to be mitigated, it would still cause the case to have an improper payment. So that since we're looking at here, again, at the case as a whole, we need to enter 0 for the total since the overall improper payment was not mitigated. So I encourage you, if you have not already, to take a look at that handout that I sent out. And if you do run into these scenarios, if you have any questions on them, we really do encourage you to reach out for technical assistance on this, because I know that it's a bit tricky, and we want to make sure that you are gathering accurate data, since it does feed into your ACF-404 report. So I'm going to stop and take a quick breath now if anyone has any questions. I don't see anything in the box or hands raised, but I'll give a moment. And then we will go ahead and start out with our section of our webinar on the online data collection system. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started with this. The Online Data Collection System, or OLDC, is the website that you will be using to enter and submit your ACF-404 final report. And I'm going to show you how to access the OLDC, but really the first step is making sure that you have access to it. Before you're able to log in, you will need to request OLD access from your ACF regional office. They can get you the form. Each state needs to have at least one user that has the capabilities of certifying and submitting the final report. And you will want to think about possibly having a backup designee for that. Because we're dealing with late June and early July, we know a lot of folks are going out of town for the summer. And if that's the case for your designee, you probably want to have a backup. Often more actions need to be taken on your report after the initial submission. After we do our review, we often need to send the report back to get some additional information. So we do need to just make sure that, you know, after, excuse me, after that initial report is submitted, that we have another person, if necessary, that can also be able to certify and submit in case the original designee is not available. Additional accounts may be requested for data entry or viewing only. Once you have your access, you can log on by going to the website that I have displayed here. We do recommend Internet Explorer for using the OLDC. Two-factor authentication may be required. If you are asked to do two-factor authentication when you log in, you'll need to download an app on your phone, or you can also choose to get a text message or a phone call. If you run into any technical issues with login, this is the email at support@acf.hhs.gov. And this again is for technical issues with logging on or problems with the website. For any content issues, questions with the 404 report, you would want to reach out to your regional office. I do see a couple of questions that came in. And actually it's two questions, both the same thing. And it's, you know, basically if you had access before, do you still need to request new access? So that depends. What I would do is email, if you've had access in the past, I would email this app support and ask if they can get your access back. You may not need to actually fill out a whole new, you know, request form. So the first step again would be to reach out to this email address. You definitely will not be able to just log on with your old password because the passwords expire after a certain period, like 60 or 90 days. But if you reach out to this email address, they might be able to, you know, set your account up again, reset your password, and then you should be okay. Okay. So once you've logged on to the Grant Solutions website, you'll be taken to a page called the Application Launch. In the upper right-hand side, there'll be a link for OLDC, and you'll go ahead and click on that. And you'll be taken to the home page, which will look like the one on the left. You have the option of switching to a enhanced home page. There's no difference in features or functionality. It's just kind of more of a cosmetic thing. The links that you see on the right-hand side are exactly the same, and once you click on those links, everything is going to look the same. So it's just purely which one you think looks nicer. Right, I see we have another question in, but I'm going to just go through a couple more slides and then I will address that question, see if we get any more in as well. So once you have accessed this home page, either the enhanced or the original, you would click on Report Form Entry, which is the top on that list of links. And then the form selection page will open, which looks like this screenshot on the bottom. Once you are on that page, from the first drop down, you select Program, which is Child Care and Development Fund Mandatory and Matching. Next, you select Grantee. In some cases, you might find that your state name shows up twice in the grantee list. I don't know if you can see it here in just the middle of the page. You can see Alaska has 2 grantees. If you do find that your state is showing up twice, please contact your regional office to make sure that you're selecting the right one. We don't want you to go under the wrong grantee, enter all your data, and then have to redo it again. And once you've selected the grantee, then the report name dropdown will show up, and you're going to select Program Performance Form, or ACF-404. And then you'll see a list of reporting periods, and you're going to click on the plus sign for the correct reporting period, which is the 10/1/2017 to 9/30/2018. The plus sign will open up a new report. Once you've started and saved your report, if you have to log out and log back in, you'll no longer see the plus sign here. You'll see, if you look down a couple of rows where there's a square and a pencil, that's what you would pick to go ahead and go in and edit the report. You can also see edit history, print, or view from this page. And then once you have clicked on that plus sign, you'll be taken to the page where you can go ahead and start entering data. So a couple of general tips for working in the OLDC. We always recommend that you save early and often, just in case something crashes, you lose your internet, drops or whatever. We don't want you to lose your work. Copy and paste should work. I know that a lot of states, like to have your report written out in Microsoft Word format so you don't lose anything. Usually, we hear that states are able, the people who are entering the report are able to copy and paste it. Sometimes there's glitches and for whatever reason it doesn't work, but again, usually it does. I mentioned this a couple slides ago, but if after submission you need to go back and make changes, that designee will need to go back, uncertify, and unsubmit in order to make further changes. Once you've entered everything, you'll need to click on, there will be a button on the data entry page that says validate. And that kind of goes and runs through a bunch of checks to make sure that everything makes sense, all the correct things are entered. And then you might see some warnings and errors. If you have warnings, please check them out, make sure everything looks good. You can still submit the report with warnings. If there's an error, that means that something, is wrong, and you will need to change that before you can certify and submit. The warnings and errors that show up will, it will say which item has the warning or error. All right, so I'm going to see what questions came in. It looks like actually that question was answered. So I'm going to, for the sake of time, move on to the next question. Thanks, Leanne, for answering that. In this next section of the webinar, we're going to walk through the different items on the final report. And we know that, some of you are not quite to the stage yet. You might still be, have a few reviews to conduct, so you're not really quite thinking about the final report yet. And that's fine, but we do want to, get a head start on this now, and we can always, provide additional trainings and technical assistance one-on-one later if you, want to revisit, revisit this in a couple months. So the ACF-404 final report consists of 3 parts. As you can see here, there's the program assurances and certifications, error measures, and then the narrative responses. The first part is, again, the assurances and certifications. And this is just a screenshot from the report itself, taken from the DCI, and you can see what this part of the report consists of. In the OLDC, a lot of this information, so like the date, your name, title, state, etc., is all pre-populated based on the information that was included in the OLDC request form. Once everything has been entered and validated, there will be a link that will show up to e-sign before submission. So part 1 here is actually completed last when you are entering everything on the OLDC. It's completed after the other 2 sections have been entered and everything's been validated. Part 2 of the 404 report is the error measures. And in order to understand, the error measures, we need to take a step back from the 404 report and consider the record review worksheet, because the information that's entered in the case summary of the record review worksheet, this forms the basis for most of the error measures in this part 2. What exactly you'll be looking at depends on whether you're using the old record review worksheet template or the new one. So if you're using the new template, it's in element 500. If you're using the old one, it's in element 410, column 4. So I'm just going to really quickly pull up a copy of the old record review worksheet so that you can see what I'm talking about here really quickly. So here is element 410, the case summary. As you can see on both examples, either 410 or 500, items 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are identical. Item 1 is where you determine whether or not where you record whether or not there was an error. Number 2 is if there was missing or insufficient documentation. Number 3 is whether there was an over or underpayment. Number 4 is what the improper payment amount was, if there was one. And number 5 is the total payment amount for the sample month. Numbers 2A through 2E are only on the new template. But again, these items, these figures that are recorded here can be gathered from the mid-tables or the data that is recorded from the mid-tables. So over the next few slides, I'm going to, again, walk through the items on the 404 one by one, and I'll share with you some hypothetical numbers to illustrate how these items might look. And I'm also going to give a few pointers on entering these items into the OLDC, since some are automatically calculated. So the first item is number of cases sampled, and this is set at 276. Item 2 is the total number of cases with an error, and this is any error, not just an improper payment error. And you can get this number by, summing up those record review worksheet case summaries. Again, that's either in element 410 column 4 or element 500 column 2. You'll be summing up the number of times you entered number 1 in number 1 of that case summary. So in our example, we're going to say that there was 45 cases with an error. Item 3 asks for the percentage of cases with an error, and that's just taking item 2 divided by item 1 and multiplying by 100 to get a percent. And so as you can see, that's 16.3%. This is one of the items that is automatically calculated in the OLDC. So you will not need to actually do the math here. Item 4 is where the improper payment amount is captured. Sorry, I said that wrong. Item 4 is the number of cases that have an improper payment. So this is from your record review worksheet case summary, the total number of cases that have both a 1 entered in number 1 as well as a number other than 0 in number 4. Number 4 in that case summary is where the improper payment amount is captured. So again, if that amount is anything other than 0, if there's some dollar amount there other than 0, then that means the case would be included in this tally. Item 5 is the amount that was entered, or the number that was entered in item 4 divided by item 1, again multiplied by 100 to get a percent. In our example, there were 20 cases with an improper payment. Item 5, the percentage is 7.25%. Item 5 is another one that is automatically calculated in the OLDC for you. So once you have entered that figure in item 4 and you hit save, then item 5 will be automatically done for you. Item 6 is the total number of cases with an improper payment error due to missing or insufficient documentation. And this is the total number of cases that had a Y in your record review worksheet summaries for item 2. So item 2 again is asking whether or not there was a missing or insufficient documentation error, as well as a number other than 0 in number 4. So we're looking at any case that had an improper payment that was indicated it was due to missing or insufficient documentation. In our example, there were 8 cases with an improper payment error due to MID. Items 7A and 7B ask about submit errors with potential improper payments. And these items cannot be calculated from the old template in element 410, but again, if you're using the old template, you should be able to easily calculate these if you've been keeping track of your mid errors, either through the Midtable or a similar data collection tool. 7A is the sum of all of the figures that were recorded in element 500, column 2, number 2A. It's also the number of rows that were completed in all of your mid-tables. So if you had, one mid-table with 2 rows completed, and then another one with 1 row completed, that would be 3, and then so on and so on. That's what you would need to sum up here. Our example state had 13 of these. 7B is the sum of potential improper payments resulting from the mid-errors. So this is the dollar amount before any additional inquiry mitigations. It's the sum of the figures recorded in element 500, column 2, number 2B, or if you're looking at the mid-tables, it would be the sum of the totals row in all of the mid-tables in column 3. And you would apply the pooling factor here if the pooled funds were used. And as an example, this state had 3,440 total dollars of potential improper payments from mid. And just a quick note about the pooling factor. This is a new requirement this cycle to make sure that you're applying the pooling factor to certain items. And the purpose is to get a more accurate representation of the actual CCDF dollars that were in error. As always, if you do have any questions about these, feel free to reach out for technical assistance. Okay. 8A, again, is another item that can't be calculated from element 410. If you're using the new record review worksheet, this will be determined by summing up the numbers recorded in element 500, column 2, number 2B. Or you can also sum up the totals row in the mid-tables in column 7. This is the total number of improper payment errors, potential improper payment errors that were able to be mitigated using the additional inquiry. In the example state, there were 5 of those. And 8B is the sum of the dollar amounts of those payments mitigated. And if you're using the new worksheet, this would be the sum of the dollar amounts entered in element 500, column 2, 2E, or it's the sum of the totals rows in the mid-tables, column 8. And again, this is another item where you would need to apply the pooling factor if applicable. Our example state had $1,320 that were mitigated. And then item 9 asks for kind of what was remaining after any additional inquiry was considered and used. So 9A is the total number of mid-errors that remained. And this is what you would get if you take 7A minus 8A, so the total number of potential mid-errors minus the number that were mitigated. Or it's the sum of the number of times that you had a 0 response in column 7 of the individual rows in the mid-table. So we have 8 here. And 9B is the total dollar amount of mid-errors that remained after the additional inquiry was considered. This is a figure that is automatically calculated in the OLDC, so you shouldn't have to do this, but I do include instructions on how to figure this figure out. All right, so moving on to item 10. Item 10 is the total amount of payments for the sampled cases. And this is going back to your record review worksheet, case summary element, either 410 or 500. This is the sum of the amounts recorded in item 5. and you would apply the pooling factor here if applicable. Our example state had 124,850. Item 11 is the total amount of improper payments for the review period. This is the gross amount of underpayments and overpayments. This item is calculated automatically in the OLDC based on what you enter for 11A and 11B. For 11A, the total amount of underpayments for the review period, you would sum up the amounts from the record review worksheet case summary, number 4. For only those record review worksheets that have a U recorded for item 3. So item 4 again is that improper payment amount. And number 3 asks if it was an overpayment or an underpayment. So for any worksheet that had an underpayment, you would sum up those amounts recorded in number 4. Apply the pooling factor here if applicable. 11B, we do the same thing. We're summing up those improper payment amounts that are recorded on the record review worksheet case summaries, but this time only for those that have an O in number 3. And again, you'd apply the pooling factor here if applicable. So we have 4590 for the amount of overpayments and 710 for the amount of underpayments. And adding those together, we get 5,300. Item 12 is our error rate, the percentage of total amount of payments for the sampled cases that are improper payments. And item 13 is the average amount of improper payments. And I do give the calculations for these two items, but they are both automatically calculated in the OLDC. Item 14A you would have to enter, and this is your total annual amount of CCDF subsidy payments for the entire universe of cases. So it's not just your sampled cases. This is going to be a very big number. You can see here for our example, we have $54 million. And item 14B is your estimated annual amount of improper payments. This is calculated automatically. You don't need to do this math. It's just taking that big, huge number from 14A and multiplying it by the error rate. Okay. Item 15 asks about the pooling factor. So you'll have to check either A, B, or C here. If your review was not based on a sample drawn from pooled funds, you would check A. And if it was drawn from a sample drawn from pooled funds, if your review was based on the sample drawn from pooled funds, you would select either B or C, depending on whether the pooling factor was from the most recent ACF-404 report. If it was, you would check off B and provide the number and percentage of sampled cases that used pooled funds. If your pooling factor was not from the most recent 800 form, you would check C and answer these 4 items. Give us the number of the pooling factor, explain its derivation, and again, indicate the number and percentage of sampled cases that use the pooled funds. And then the last item in part 2 asks about replacement cases. As a reminder, you must receive approval from the regional office to use any replacement case. There is space in the OLDC to record the month that a replacement case was used, the reason for using the replacement case, and the number of times that that reason was used. And you also in the OLDC have the capability to add additional rows if you need to record additional months that used replacement cases or reasons. So you can see in this example, I've just said that in October there was no payment made in the sample month, and that reason was used twice. All right, so that's all of the items in part 2. I don't think I see any more questions or hands raised. So in the interest of time, I'm going to hand it over to Leanne to complete our discussion. But, again, feel free to enter questions if you do have anything.
Thank you, Katie. Yep, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off on part 3 of the 404 report, the narrative responses. So these, of course, are all of the written responses to items 17 through 25 on the report. So item 17, you can see here, you are going to be asked to describe lessons learned or improvements made in implementation of the review process during the current review cycle. So for this item, you're going to want to think about what your team did during this cycle that may have been different from the previous one. You're going to want to think about what you learned as you implemented your SDAP, anything that may have changed during your process, and then maybe those changes that were a result of things that you learned or discovered. Maybe you had some obstacles that you had to overcome with staffing or system. So you're going to want to describe that and how you overcame those obstacles. All right, so here's what item 18 is looking like. And this one corresponds with item 7A above. So 7A, an example for this one, if the state had 12 potential mid-IP errors, then you're going to have at least 12 rows here that you're going to need to complete. And you do need to add a row for all potential improper payment errors that are due to MID, regardless of whether an additional inquiry was used. And all of the data needed here can be pulled from your MID tables. So let's go ahead and walk through an example. Column A is asking for the element of the record review worksheet where that error was identified. So in our example here, we're going to say it was element 330. And if you have that MID table in front of you, it's column 1 of the MID table. Column B is asking for a description of the documentation that was the MID. What was missing? So in our example, we're saying it was verification of the child's citizenship. That's column 2 of the MID table. Column C is the dollar amount of the potential improper payment. Here we have 510, and that's the same as column 3 on your MID table. Column D is a description of the additional inquiry that was done, or an explanation of why there was no appropriate additional inquiry to complete. So on the MID table, you'll combine information from column 4 and then either 5 or 6, depending on whether an AI was used. And here in our example, we said, yes, we reached out to Vital Records to obtain the verification. Column E, if an additional inquiry was used, you'll enter the dollar amount, if any, that was able to be mitigated. So again, if you're looking at your MID table, this is column 8. And in our example, we said the entire potential improper payment amount of 510 was able to be mitigated. And then column F, again, if an AI was used, how the state determined whether or not the potential improper payment could be mitigated. And that's going to be the same as column 9 on the MID table. So you can see here, Vital Records provided the birth certificate, which verified the child's citizenship. And there's another example for you, but again, I think in the interest of time, we'll just go ahead and move to the next slide. So item 19 is asking to identify all causes of improper payments, list each cause, the number of cases with an error due to this cause, an example of an error, and whether this cause involved missing or insufficient documentation. So in this item, you'll need to provide all of your improper payment error causes. If any of you were involved in the last cycle, you might recall that you only had to provide the 2 most common MID and the 2 most common non-MID errors. So we only asked you to provide 2 before. But this time, we have one item asking you to list all error causes. So in our example here, and mostly due to space, we have 3 error causes shown. So here in our example state, we had 12 errors caused by payment calculation errors. And the example here is that all sources of income were not included. And in this example, it was not a mid-error. Then you can see the second one, there were 8 cases identified with errors caused by income verification. And then the example, missing pay stubs from the case file. And this one was a mid-error, missing or insufficient documentation. All right, so item 20, this one is sort of a continuation of 19. For each of those improper payment error causes identified in 19, you're going to need to describe action steps planned to meet those targeted reductions. And those targets are going to be entered in item 23, which we'll get to in just a couple more slides here. So looking at this table, the first column, cause of error, that one is going to be pre-populated for you in the OLDC based on what you entered for item 19. The action steps are detailed descriptions of specific activities planned in order to reach those targeted reductions. The timeline, that's going to be a schedule of activities or events and should indicate when the specific action steps that were described in the previous column, when they should be completed. The progress measurement, of course, that's a measurement or another appropriate indicator enabling you to track completion of those planned action steps. And then, of course, whether they have the desired effect in reducing errors. For item 21, this one is broken down into A and B. For 21A, you're going to enter the amount of improper payments that are expected to be recovered. If that amount is less than the amount of overpayments entered, then you're going to describe the reasons that might limit the collection of those overpayments. In determining your estimates here, just consider the history of your state and the history of recovery efforts. There might be laws that limit the collection amount. So again, just take into consideration the history of your success or perhaps non-success in recovering overpayments. For 21B, you're going to enter the improper payment amount that was collected as a result of the previous review. If the amount was less than the expected amount identified on the previous 404 report, then you need to describe the reasons why. So why you weren't able to collect the total amount reported. Moving to item 22, this one asks you to describe the information systems and other infrastructure that assist the state in identifying and reducing improper payments. If the lead agency does not have these tools, describe actions to be taken to acquire the necessary information systems and other infrastructure. All right, so for this one, information systems, that could include automated systems that help with accurate eligibility determinations, systems or reports that help to identify and reduce errors, or maybe systems that help overall with your improper payment process. A more specific example may be an integrated eligibility system where there's multiple programs sharing verification documents related to eligibility. Another one might be alerts that are generated to eligibility workers that provide some of those soft warnings during case processing. For this one, we'd also like you to include any plans to acquire additional systems or to update any existing infrastructure. For item 23, I alluded to this one a little bit earlier, but this item is all about the error measure data or targets for the prior, current, and next cycle. Just another little footnote here maybe, this item is also where OCC pulls the national measures for the current cycle data that they report on each year in that agency financial report. This is a pretty important item, at least from OCC's perspective. The error measures reported here, you can see are percentages of cases with an error, percentages of cases with an improper payment, percentage of total amount of payment for the sample that are improper payments, the average amount of improper payments, and an estimated annual amount of improper payments. The good thing about this table is the columns for the prior cycle data, prior cycle target, and current cycle target are all pre-populated based on last cycle's report. Also, the column for the current cycle data is populated based on what you entered back in part 2. The only column that you actually need to complete here is the targets for the next cycle. But of course, it's good to check the other figures to ensure accuracy. Item 24. For this one, you'll refer back to the action items identified in item 20, and those were the ones related to the causes of IP errors. And here you're going to describe how those actions, or describe the actions that will be used to address the areas where the targets were not met. And for item 25, for this item, you're going to need to refer to your previous 404 report, 404 from the last cycle. So the first column, improper payment error, this will pre-populate in the OLDC based on what was entered in your last cycle. But to assist in completing this table, you're going to want to look at item 17 in the previous report to see what was entered for planned action steps and the timeline. So in the second column here, you'll describe the actions that were fully implemented or progress made towards full implementation, including dates and how progress toward implementation, how it was monitored. You'll also include here any additional action steps that were taken, even if they were not included in that prior report. You'll then describe the impact that the actions had on reducing improper payment errors, how progress was measured, and then any barriers or setbacks to reducing the error. And another little tidbit of information for this one, for those that were around for the last cycle submission, this is the same question that was asked in the last cycle, but there's just a different format to gather the responses. So OCC has been getting a lot more questions related to how states are reducing errors. So the table was updated just to continue to capture the information, but in a slightly different way. All right. So that's it for the 404 and OLDC. Do we have any other questions or hand raised? Katie, it looks like
I do see one question. One moment.
Yep, just real quick, we have reached 5 o'clock. We can hang on for another 5 or 10 minutes or so. If folks have questions, we will stay online. Or you can also type any questions into the questions panel, and we can follow up after the webinar if there's folks that need to hop off. But I think for the sake of time here, I'm going to go ahead and finish up the slides. But then, again, we can stay on and answer any additional questions. For slide 48, just real quickly, TA support that's offered by the Subsidy Center. We have the OLDC just-in-time training. This is a one-on-one TH session, talking too fast now. We generally share a screen. We can use GoToMeeting. We can use Adobe, Skype, whatever you're comfortable with. We'll walk through the ACF-404 together, as well as the OLDC, the Online Data Collection System. Your report does not have to be ready in order to have that training, and really we can offer it any time between now and, say, mid-June. We probably wouldn't want to wait too long in June. Our NICSIA or Subsidy Center Error Rate Specialist can review a draft of your 404, and that can be something that you submit, via email, or we also have access to the OLDC, and we can go in and review your draft there. To request technical assistance, please reach out to your ACF regional office. Also here, next steps for Year 3 state. If you haven't done so already, please request OLDC logins from your regional office. If you would like, we can set up the just-in-time training with you. And finally here, please submit your ACF-404 no later than June 30th, and we definitely would love to see it earlier if at all possible. And your NICSIA Error Rate Specialists are identified there. Region 1 is me, Leanne. Region 7 is Janae. And for all other regions, you are lucky to have Katie. So I believe that's it for the actual webinar. But again, we're going to stick around and we're going to answer any other questions that may remain.
Yes, there was a question that came in, and since I think I'm going to follow up with her after the webinar so I can provide her with some additional information. But if there is anything else, I will stick around for a couple more minutes. But thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. And actually, let's see. We did have a question come in about the pooling factor. So, and again, Kim, I think that we might want to discuss this after the webinar. I'm going to make a note to follow up with you because the pooling factor can take a lot longer than just 2 minutes to talk about. But I definitely will follow up with you. And this goes for anyone if you have questions about the pooling factor. I know this is something new this go around. So we are happy to discuss with you offline about that.
That sounds good. I don't see any other questions. But again, we can hang out if anyone, wants to raise their hand and ask a question. Or again, we can leave the line open or leave the webinar open so you can type in any questions and we can follow up.
And also, there is an evaluation that will pop up as you leave the webinar, and you have the option to enter any questions, follow-up questions in there as well. Okay. All right, seeing nothing else coming in, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar, but thank you so much for joining us this afternoon again, and we'll look forward to working with you further as you complete this report. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.